Hello everyone, today we start our series about Harald Sigurdsson, Harald Hardrada's saga, according to Schwerpunkt. Of course, this is a mini-series. I shouldn't tell all the time whether this belongs to a series or not, especially if a playlist is not dedicated to it. But of course, this is a proper story that we follow in a couple of videos, probably three, about one of the most captivating, fascinating, even enigmatic to the degree that history, of course, in 11th century Northern Europe and however also other places around the world could be, marking also the last point of the so-called Viking era. Essentially, on September the 25th, 1066, Harald Sigurdsson, the Norwegian king, and one of the greatest leaders of his time, laid dead on the Stamford Bridge battlefield. According to legend, right, an English arrow lodged in his throat. I will also make a video about the sources on the life of Harald because, of course, we are in a time where still history meets myth, that is not necessarily a negative thing, but as you know, the entire issue of Snorri Sturluson describing different types of, say, of fatal divine judgment, both for Harald and Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings, hit by an arrow in the eye, which of course is loaded with symbological meaning and can be profitably criticized as writing centuries after the events. Some of the story was embellished. We, by the way, read at some point Snorri Sturluson, the video on the Battle of Brunanburh, in fact illustrating that and how that 13th century mentality loaded already with a much more sort of knightly, chivalric, feudal mentality. It doesn't matter how sort of still archaic and traditional in an Icelandic, and also in the sense Norwegian context could have been altered. There is veritable history in it. There is a lot of plausible historical information and military logic that cannot make us exclude such sources a priori, as many people do, like saying, "Oh, this is fabricated," so it's not actually, first of all, reliable, and especially it's not describing what would have actually happened in the moment. This is something that, as you know, as a medievalist and with my earned chevrons, I totally reject for obvious reasons of diachronic and comparative habit practice. This is not much what we will be discussing about Harald, but of course we can't stop at every notion about his life and saying, well, but we kind of don't fully know, right? That's why I want the series to be a bit saga-like also in the telling, because after all, it's all we know, right? And we can also make some informed criticism and judgment on this information along the way, regardless of also the broader philological, literary analysis of the sources. But I will make a video on that as well, because it's important methodologically, analytically, and it will also show what we're doing in here. The Battle of Stamford Bridge we will also cover in a video on its own. It's too important of a clash not to be covered. You can imagine with this, again, fatal moment, there is a sense that we explained in the beliefs of these people that by the 11th century and already before that time, people had lost the hope, so to say, which is, however, always the last to die, isn't it? That men can save themselves. And definitely Harald Sigurdsson's death at Stamford Bridge in a way encapsulates further that passage in a broader sort of horizon of mixed beliefs, Christian, pre-Christian. It is true, as we've seen in our videos about the North Germanic religion, how, telling the truth, the Northeastern European fringe had actually always been darker as far as the possibility of the warrior to attain divinity by sacrificing himself in holy combat. But it's not like there was a categorical divide, right? The more Apollonian, Roman, and Hellenic mindset stemmed from an obviously greater achievement of the respective Indo-European conquerors. The North had been a bit more countercultural, had been darker, as opposed, like, think about the crow, as opposed to the eagle, right? But the same Apollonian symbolism still existed, and definitely Harald Sigurdsson incarnated a really heroic figure that, by losing his life and the battle, by the way, together with the possibilities of seizing the English throne, would really etch in this tapestry of history a moment of dramatic fall, right? Of even what could look at the best champion, warrior, leader, man, right? His royal guard clustered around his body, but we can imagine how sort of broken by the realization this man would be, still, drawing from the corpse enshrined, as we will see now, but this idea of holiness earned in arms, according to the military religious vision of the era, also for those who were not later canonized, inspiring them. But the Anglo-Saxons at that point were galvanized by the achievement and advanced relentlessly. I could say the Anglo-Danes by this time, but, we made also enough videos about Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Danish history to know what we're talking about. Cutting the Norse down and triggering a collapse of the Viking forces, right? The English triumph led by King Harold Godwinson was so decisive that only 24 of the 300 Viking longships Harold had brought to England allegedly returned to Scandinavia. All right, this had been almost a surprise clash, or at least the Anglo-Danes had speeded, as you know, towards the north with a lightning campaign that had caught the Norse off guard, bringing to the destruction also of their bridgehead on the North Sea coast of Britain. This catastrophic loss included the death of Harald's ally as well, Tostig Godwinson, that was notoriously Harold's own brother, who had treacherously joined the Norwegian invasion to reclaim his earldom of Northumbria, that I also just recently made a video on, further weakening the Viking cause, right? These are incredibly notorious events, especially to a largely Anglo-American audience like my own. But it's important, to consider the magnitude of Harold's death context, so to say. The crushing defeat was so profound that, in fact, the Norwegian king's disappearance is frequently cited, as we were saying before, as marking probably the close of the Viking era. The Scandinavians would keep doing similar things, but indeed away from Britain. Right? It would continue. We also made a video about the Battle of Largs. There is a lot of Norse infestation, especially of northern Britain, of Ireland in later centuries, and even if you look at, Scandinavian crusaders to the Holy Land in the following generations, we're not talking about those in the Baltic, will essentially continue very much their lifestyle, as well, however, as we have seen in our videos about medieval Scandinavia, a relentless process of state building, as gradual as definitive. Frankly, I find later medieval Scandinavian history and warfare much more interesting than one of the Viking era. But this is just me in general, and I know it's not a popular opinion, but who cares about what people think in that regard? Harald representing indeed this also conjunction, right, in all. And we've seen how in military history, normally and in the history of civilization in general, when the traditional myths with not much the modern, but there is this augmentation of power, there is definitely a pivotal figure, a model leadership, a general quality that really shines through the eras in unprecedented and also unrepeated fashion. So Harald Sigurdsson embodies this point. Besides, the Norwegian king had really entered the legend during his lifetime, leaving a trail of epithets in the later memory in the historiography that, in fact, characterized his multifaceted person. First of all, we know him as, Harald Sigurdsson, as we will see now, also looking at his early life, but even more famously, Hardrada, so hard ruler, an epithet translated variously as hard. Let's say this Old Norse has very old sort of old Indo-European languages. A very rich semantic, so it can mean different things. It's all-encompassing, but it was translated in this case as hardened counsel, tyrannical, tyrant, ruthless, savage in counsel, tough, severe, resolute. And again, none of these words, even the preferred severe and resolute, simply explain how properly the concept would have been felt by the Norse and the peoples who met with Harald at the time. In several independent sources from the British Isles, however, we also have other epithets. Interestingly enough, these sources predate the writing down of the Icelandic sagas, and in them, Harald is given epithets that, while deriving from the Old Norse, also mean different things. For example, Harfagri, which means hair beautiful, such as Harald Arfagera, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle Manuscript D version. Arafag in Orderic Vitalis, Arvagra, John of Worcester, Harvagre, William of Malmesbury in the Gesta Regum Anglorum, Arbach, from Marianus Scotus of Mainz, and Harald Arfagir in the life of Gruffudd ap Cynan or Sinan. These are all relatively close sources in time, just essentially a century or a few later. While the name Harald Fairhair is more famously linked to the earlier Norwegian king in Icelandic sagas, historians now suggest that Harald Hardrada was widely known, in fact, at the time as Harald Fairhair, rather, with the possibility that Fairhair was, in fact, the same Harald's preferred one, while the adjective, again, Hardradi, severe, was rather an epithet given by his opponents in later 13th century Old Norse king sagas. The term cannot be ruled out, however, as basically we're talking the same language, and again, just a few hundred years later, so it's not like Old Norse would have changed at that point to the degree of eliminating the concept of Hardrada that would have surely resonated in the same Scandinavia of the time. The concept of fair hair is naturally very much connected with the traditional genetic racial sense of, again, the God's chosen kin. And there is indeed in hair proper, like is in many other epic works in the millennia, probably the concept of strength, of virility, of masculinity, and the fair element properly, denoting the gold of the Asgard, right? The gold of the Aesir. These things were very much there. We've seen it very often in our videos about Indo-European theology. It's literally all over the places, even though people today won't sort of deny the fact that there was probably a racial connotation to moral value in the ancient world. I described it even for the Roman italics in ancient history. And every time you say this, you basically pass for some kind of white supremacist or whatever, but it's literally what we find philologically and literally, and it also makes sense in some broader terms. Nevertheless, the notion that earlier Harald Fairhair existed as depicted in sagas is also now doubted, as Harald Hardrada's alleged descent from the same Harald Fairhair, so the previous Norwegian king with that name, claimed his Snorri Sturluson's Ames Kringla through his father's Sigurd Seir's lineage, is considered an invention. There was an element to this, indeed, the fact that when Harald's own claim to the Norwegian throne were made, Ancestry did not play actually that specific role. I mean, in a genealogical sense, the fact that Harald would have descended from his alleged namesake ancestor was not in the moment the political reason why he could access the throne. For the rest, Ancestry was of radical, paramount, almost total importance in a general sense, probably in, again, understanding the degree by which you had descended from the gods or God in absolute sense. And so how much of your divinity was there for you to claim rule over other people. So this is also the mindset that, especially at this very top, in fact, of high nobility, when actually not royalty, in inspiring, by the way, to the control of the entire Scandinavia at this point and beyond, was felt by these people. So we're not talking about some sort of film, say, I don't know, this was just a random guy, it could have been you, right? Like despicable shows like Vikings, like with these punks with, no muscle, no fiber, always hysterically emotional and acting like backstreet, lesser people from the forte estate of some metropolitan area in one of the most secularized and modernized countries, have nothing to do with this, unspeakable figures in by every psychophysical dimension, of course, overloaded with a traumatically high level of, virility, charisma, authority, a sense of properly of traditional leadership and spiritual elevation above a rigid stratification of who was under. By the way, we are literally in the later Viking era, so we're talking about de facto proto-feudal and almost completely Christianized and very advanced moment where the average free man could be sort of free just in a fringe reality, eating really the scraps of the wealth that the great, in fact, Scandinavian monarchies at this point had managed to put together. Yes, it was an incredibly brutal, archaic, primitive, and surely also poor world, compared especially to the continent. That's not even talk Mediterranean. That's also why, of course, as you know, in Harald's time, he will take some tours, let's say, some cruisers across the sort of the Roman lake. Nevertheless, when you look at, in fact, the spirit of Harald, the legacy of his force, you can't feel all this mystical vibe behind that. For example, Harold Godwinson himself would meet his own demise just 19 days later at the Battle of Hastings, that I finally made a video on last year, because it may sound bad, that a medieval warfare, in particular base channel, in 2,500 videos, still not covered. By the way, just the times and meaning of Hastings, as opposed to tactical analysis that we will make as usual in depth in another video. Godwinson, that was killed by Duke William in Normandy, later dubbed the Conqueror, changing in that sense the entire dichotomy and paradigm in entire Britain, connecting that to the Frankish world from which William came from, right? It's useless sometimes to flatter some kind of Norse legacy in the House of Normandy. At that point, there were Western Franks in everything, right? If, of course, like in the St. William case, they descended from Scandinavians. As many, by the way, Franks did, especially in those areas. If you have an idea of how, for example, the Anglo-Saxon migration also happened, some of them left literally from Merovingian held territory. That's not the point. The point is that definitely the defeat, not just of Harald, but of Harold, really proved in a deeper sense the end of an era. Right, the Anglo-Danish model was not a Frankish-derived one, like the ones that were mostly successful in Europe at this time, including, by the way, in southern Italy, where the Normans would, in fact, crash also by invading the Byzantine Empire and defeating their Varangians at the Battle of Dyrrhachium, as we've seen in other videos, probably an entire level of fringe world, right, that people don't often like to hear in these terms, because in part it involves Northern Europe. There's this, again, idea that the Vikings also were this enormous military performance, and that also the Byzantine Empire today is everything, but nobody realizes that the by far more advanced system in all of this, politically, militarily, socially, and beyond, was the Latin Germanic world of essentially post-Carolingian Europe, and I mean really by far, and with an upper hand at this point on basically everybody involved: the Vikings, the Byzantines, the Muslims, etc., that really will, like a tidal wave, eventually steamroll practically everything along the way. Just as much the Normans succeeded, albeit with difficulty, at the Battle of Hastings, right? Harald in this game can be seen as literally the guy who opposed William the Conqueror, even though basically had Harald won, William would have become his contender, but God knows how things would have actually ended at that point. This is one of the greatest crossroads in history. If anything, we will look at that later. We don't begin from the end, but it's more like, how did I get myself in this situation? Well, let's start from the beginning. Cut. And it's important to reflect on this, given also how important destiny was for these warriors. And again, in their hope to surpass that, especially by feats of arms, their entire life was pictured, right, in a broader sense, with a deeper meaning. And that's exactly what, as a full circle, right, Harald's life came to an end. Besides, Harald's death at Stamford Bridge is often overshadowed in historical accounts by the Battle of Hastings itself. I mean, not so much, because everybody knows. One of the very few things, and everything ends there, that maybe the average person knows, especially in some parts of the world. However, there is also a history behind this that is important to focus on. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, together with the Battle of Hastings, marked the end of one of the most characteristic medieval military cultures, we could stress, because also the Anglo-Danes, as we've seen, were not simply just Anglo-Saxons or simply Scandinavian, right? And for that, we'll have to make way more content, because we have a few of that still. Harald's life was filled with exploits stretching across Europe, from Norway to North Africa, Constantinople to Britain, and defined an exceptional martial prowess and political savvy, influencing the entire century. Right, this Northern European world becoming more relevant, more important, as it was now to be fully tied to probably also the Latin Germanic world, feudalization, Christianization, and making, again, the main Scandinavian powers protagonists in this broader, now fully probably westernized dimension. I made a video about English and Welsh warfare from the 11th to the 14th century, and we start essentially from this earlier phase, before 1066. So you can see the Northern European influences at that point in the continuing in also this essentially Western Frankish military culture established by the Normans after the conquest of Britain. That, by the way, spread, in fact, this post-Carolingian model far and wide. We've seen also how Scotland was essentially Normanized, as in part it had been Anglicized before and continued to be so naturally, and the overlapping of all of these military cultures. Something in, say, British warfare continued with some sort of Norse flavor. This is especially the case for Scotland, but also in northern England. You see a lot of Norse influence, normally not in a flattering sense, meaning that the land was more primitive, there was less surplus, so there was literally less cavalry, less armor around, and so it looks somehow more northern. We know that there were connections during the Viking era between, say, Ireland and Ruthenia in terms of specific helmets designed. There was a survival, for example, of the Spangenhelm structure, right, in most of the Vikings, for example, helmet construction. There is, I used, in fact, one for Harald, more typically also in the thumbnail. Today we look at the early life of Harald. We also had a pretty precocious military training, because these were men at literally 14 had hundreds of followers in the retinue. We're stopping essentially by 1034, all right. Harald was born in 1015, or possibly the year after, in Ringerike, Norway, to Åsta Gudbrandsdatter and her second husband Sigurd Syr, a petty king of Ringerike and one of the Uppland's strongest and wealthiest chieftains. Thus, as we just said, actually a pretty rich place by Scandinavian standards, and or at least in a context that allowed to interfere at the higher level of politics by the region, sort of civilizational development. Harald was the youngest of three half-brothers to King Olaf, Harald's son, later Saint Olaf of Norway through his mother. So consider the literal royalty connection. Unlike his two older brothers, who resembled their down-to-earth father in their focus on maintaining the family farm, so to say, young Harald displayed traits of an ambitious rebel, at least in youth, admiring Olaf as his role model. That was, in fact, a military one, right? When we look at the Scandinavian, saying to the Anglo-Saxon ones, we're looking at people that spent their entire life fighting, all right? And that, however, were properly understood in terms of spiritual terms as kings, right? In terms of military religious accomplishment, as we said, self-sacrifice in holy combat that they actually eventually achieved because they were killed, so in the sense / martyrized in battle. And the term is perfectly fine. I mean, what is weird about the sort of normalized version of Christianity today, we don't realize that martyrized means that literally witnesses to God in the form of, at least through the Holy Ghost, that is the tamed and possessed lower nature of your own soul that transcends into divinity, as you summon that in the midst of battle and transfigured her as the heavenly glory herself. So rebel to the degree of course, of the relatively conservative Scandinavian order. All right, the fact that the Viking era had been indeed one of daring enterprises against some general, let's say, ambition of some local powers to maintain instead greater order, and this had gradually actually built up the same, and that's why Harald was so inspired by figures that were truly believed to, in this sense, also partially share his blood, and therefore maintain that higher connection to divinity that would elicit such broader ambitions. Besides, against the notion that Harald was some sort of more anarchic figure, as for some reason, of course, the Fourth Estate has decided that we have to make anyone, fighting against power, the entire European tradition is founded on the diametrically opposite concept, first of all. And this is the true also for Harald, right? That if anything, it was more enterprising in order to actually build power, right? So, say, Scandinavian society historically was wary of the elevation of certain figures to greater power, and the Vikings, in a sense, had done exactly that. They had collected riches abroad, they had come back home gathering more power, more war bands, and building essentially that power that eventually will reduce the local liberties. Even there is all a process of demilitarization. You can see it in the gradual participation to delay anger as something ever more diluted and paid in nature, etc. Harald was really galvanized by the figure of Olaf, given that his early exposure to warfare, first of all, had likely began under him, his tutelage, as it was completely normal in this de facto proto-feudal dimension where the son of noblemen were sent to be fostered at the courts, in fact, of these other great leaders. This was really the case with Norway. We're talking here a Norwegian context, even though, again, the Norse were pretty, again, touring across this, but especially at an elite level, and especially at a warband level, all across the region. There were also Slavs, other elements within this. Olaf had been himself fostering a martial culture in Norway, emphasizing Christian ideals alongside Viking tradition. So definitely also not something that Harald could dismiss or was not in line with, because this was yet the Christian declination of the old Catholic tradition that also Wodanism belonged to, right? If you're unfamiliar with this concept, I say it all the time. I made tens of videos about traditional and Indo-European theology. If you're properly unfamiliar with the concept that all great powers, religions before Christianity were Catholic, and that Christianity is perfectly in the wake of that, at least, in fact, what we now narrow down to a sort of just a confession like Catholicism, which is the only possible form of Christianity by theological foundation, also in continuity with tradition of all these other peoples. Well, just be aware of that. Harald's life took a dramatic turn pretty early on, at the age 15. Consider that manhood was achieved basically around these years. Where in 1030, when Harald joined Olaf in the tremendous battle of Stiklestad against the Danish king Canute the Great, who reigned between 1016 and 1035. As you know, we're looking at some of the most brutal rivalries in the entire Viking era. We're looking also at one of the largest scaled engagements of the time. Canute was the most powerful of all the Viking kings. He ruled also in England. He had connections with Rome. He went over to the Pope. He was really, from a Danish base, that was essentially the more civilized, the more advanced, building a veritable, especially sea empire in the north that involved, of course, quite significant ambitions and at some point control over the same kingdom of Norway. Olaf, a Christian king during Scandinavia's transition from, again, this pre-Christian to a Christian, and more from a sort of fractally paganistic fringe reality into an imperial Catholic traditional one, had seized Norway's throne in 1015, while Canute was engaged in England, right? So he basically snatched one of the most important realms in the north, exploiting this quite demanding commitment that Canute had made to keep together all this enormous amount of territory. So it seemed like almost a cosmic clash against, again, one of the greatest rulers of the era that could, however, in a double-edged sword sense, seen also as the anti-Catholic dealer. And of course, Olaf's ambitions were exactly the same of Canute. Canute returned to Scandinavia in 1028 following a revolt, forcing Olaf into exile in Ruthenia, where he stayed until 1029. Returning with an army to Scandinavia, Olaf marched through Sweden in 1030, recruiting warriors, crossed the Kiolen Mountains, and descended into the Verdal Valley in central Norway's Nord-Trøndelag region. Harald, gathering 600 men from the uplands, met Olaf upon his arrival in eastern Norway and joined his campaign to reclaim the throne, which Canute had captured. You understand how young he was, as much as how many men were already in his following, mirroring his uncommon characteristics. Like many rulers sort of lasted too few in charge, so that we can't fully say what they would have become. Imagine Harald dying at this point. Nobody would have really ever known what kind of man he was, how much gifted. But this is exactly the decisive aspect. This is a tremendous initiation to a greater, not just warfare scale, but also of political involvement. That is just the launching pad of the hero in his lifetime. On July the 29th, 1030, at Stiklestad, one of Norway's most pivotal battles, Olaf's 3,600-strong army formed a shield wall on a hill facing a 7,000-man Viking force led by Canute's ally, Kalv Arnason. Outnumbered nearly 2-1, Olaf awaited reinforcement under Dag Ringsson. As those reinforcements appeared, Kalv ordered his larger army to advance. Olaf rallied his men, shouting, "Forward, forward, Christmen, crossmen, kingsmen." This belongs again to the legion of the warrior saint king, that, as you understand here, was less powerful than Canute, even in his own land, and that had picked a defensive position, resolute to stand their ground or die. The armies clashed in a fierce melee that we have seen in other videos about probably Viking tactics. We'll come back on that, if anything. Arms and armor, already done something about that. Battle of axes, swords, thrusting spears, described by one observer of the battle as a steel storm. Right? This also gives you probably the idea of the courageous nature of the first ranks of the Viking phalanx, so to say. That was naturally the most robust, made up of the best warriors. Young warriors were common, of course, in Viking warfare, especially also because life was brutally short. Also, not just because of the general condition of the times and places, but because of this normal involvement since an early age into actual warfare. Olaf himself, having raided at age 12 for the first time and fought in England by 14. Harald, likely due to his youth and status, was, however, probably kept from the front lines in this circumstance. And this was very important for political reasons. You understand how we mostly talk of the Renaissance as the moment in which kings were increasingly kept away from the fray due to, again, the dramatic damage and complications that their loss was involved. Here, Olaf wanted to have specific figures backing him, probably had already realized Harald's valor. We're not really 100% sure that he wouldn't fight at the Battle of Stiklestad. Snorri Sturluson notes his presence and considerable military talent during the battle, by the way, but again, it can't part of a broader chivalric feudal narrative of the 13th century Icelandic saga writer. The battle's ferocity was a marvel to witness, was intensified by, of course, the use of, like, the most traditional Scandinavian tactics of the era, including the berserkers, elite warriors known for their frenzied combat style. Admittedly, these were already a bit less relevant than they had historically been. Initially, I made an entire video explaining who these people were. In theory, all freemen to by that compact degree of, again, attempted divine achievement were to pass through this lower incarnation of wild beasts to eventually tame them and surpassing them, this superhuman force, and through their later career, in fact, emerging as Apollonian rulers, like celebrating mostly the heavenly glory, the skies, not the forest underworld, so to say. Tacitus tells us that entire peoples like the Lugi could resort to that. We know that in early medieval warfare, these were considered picked units of quite experienced warriors. In the mid-Viking period, we have essentially them transitioning towards something more like military professionals, some form of mercenaries. I mean, it was the same warriors that were gradually sort of modernizing and secularizing towards sort of more effective collective training. Berserkers, if anything, were more famous for further specialization with specific fencing techniques, some sort of greater physical training, an ascetical life in the forest, etc. We will explain how this actually worked, because they were literally possessed, right, by the deity. They were actual bears, actual wolves in the case of the Othodnars. By the late Viking era, essentially, these were just turned into bandits and brigands, right? Sometimes not even the average Scandinavian farmer defending his property was so scared of them. I mean, werewolves, I mean, I have, even family memories of things like that, because there are actual anthropological dynamics at play. And on such an illustrious early 11th century battlefield, you could imagine, in fact, people coming from far and wide, including still these quite select warriors, reportedly in this case present among Olaf's forces, interestingly enough, as a Christian ruler, which perfectly also aligns with what we know, with continuation, at least gradual transformation in this practice is also in the ways knights were trained. It's full of this all over Europe in the High Middle Ages, in the fully knightly feudal dimension, and again, people tend to think it's just like a Norse thing, etc. It's just because the Norse were at that level of development that other peoples had already passed, and having already used that. The battle famously ended in a disastrous fashion for Olaf, who was in fact killed, martyrized in that sense. Martyr, as I was saying before, meaning probably witness to Christ, in this case to God in any case, so that albeit losing, Harald had made it into heaven and also left a physical and metaphysical legacy to carry on his struggle, while Harald, badly wounded, again, if we are to stick to some sources rather than others, escaped with the aid of Olaf's kinsman Ragnvald Brusason, later Earl of Orkney, by the way, and I made a video about the Earldom of Orkney army organization if you're interested in that. Great seafarers, I mean, the Norwegian Vikings having that particular bias, but, this belonging pretty much to most of the North, but especially the ones who entered further west, right, to the British Isles, to Iceland, and even to North America. I remember, I can't stress enough how, childishly, ridiculous a show like Viking is when, the end of battle is just at some point some warriors starting to taking the way of the woods in different directions, and then they, after the defeat, they simply sit and drink and say, we have been defeated. But, a bit of exposure to imperial Catholic traditional sense of what it means to lose a battle, right? To see literally the furies being unhinged in front of you, like people chopped to pieces, severe trauma, the loss of an entire kingdom, all the warriors coming from for your family's destinies, your property. Here, exiles sprawling across Scandinavia, being chased by their opponents, violence arising, people burned alive, massacred, property set on fire, further raids. I mean, this is the kind of psychophysical situation in which you find yourself after a battle, and it is one of the single most informing experiences in somebody's life. I mean, whichever Harald's participation to the Battle of Stiklestad was, what he actually had to go through after it was akin to all the brutality that this clash had entailed, right? And they were actually killing people along the way. I mean, even if Olaf had sheltered him during the battle, Harald had already killed people, right? Had already chopped people to pieces. This was how rigidly and brutally and specifically these people were designed. We should be extremely precise about this. The purpose of a Norse chieftain in the 11th century was to turn into a killing machine capable of claiming on his deathbed, if he had any bed were to die, to have slaughtered people, I think in the thousands is fair, and by hand, right? This is the only purpose that also medieval knighthood has. This is the purpose of our military, exterminating the largest amount of enemies as possible, right? Von Clausewitz is crystal clear on this, right? War has the objective of sort of as an act of violence to compel your enemy to fulfill your will. This is the conceptual theoretical definition. Von Clausewitz says, even though it's not quite literally the same thing, this in war passes largely, virtually entirely through the physical eradication of the enemy armed forces, which means a biblical bath of blood, for which the military is exclusively, thank God, and perfectly designed for. Then eventually performance can be more or less affected, but this is what these people have perfectly ingrained, right, in their brains. And by the way, these are leaders were psychophysically selected across the generations just through this kind of warfare, right? Just mentally, physically, only the people who were fit for this survive, right? Harald was notoriously 2 meters tall. This is no exaggeration. It was also, this wasn't much because of Scandinavia. I mean, the average height would have been something like 180 centimeters, right? But there were these giants that naturally, especially in this kind of primal warfare, that was still, as we've seen, very, very direct, right? Very muscular, very physical, in a protected sense, we're literally face to face in a phalanx where you can't escape, right? Vikings actually made extensive use of cavalry. Even up to a third of their forces could be mounted. It's a complete myth that they didn't use that or weren't good at it, especially at this time, by the way. They had very sort of specialized and effective armies, as just like most, Europeans in general. So the picture is probably all the most graphically intense you can imagine for this kind of clashes. Harald barely made it alive out of Scandinavia with a group of his warriors heading east at that point to Ruthenia, the Kievan Rus that, as we've seen, had already offered shelter to Olaf. Gardariki or Svithjoth in Mikla. The two terms respectively refer to the realm of fortresses and Great Sweden. This is how the Norse saw Ruthenia, that, as you know, had historically been taken over by the Rurik dynasty. Rorik had some, affairs also in the North Sea, and he had clashed against the Carolingians. He had been in Frisia. However, and he was of likely Danish origin. However, in any case, aside from, again, the fact that the various Scandinavian countries were relatively fluidly, overlapping to some degree, and by elite especially, predictably, for geographical reasons, it was mostly the Swedes who were involved in Ruthenia. So the broader service of Scandinavian warriors at the courts of the Slavic princes of Eastern Europe was mostly made up by Swedes. All these elites had, generally speaking, mixed blood across Northern Europe, so it was completely normal to have connections at an elite level across a pretty wide horizon of lands and polities. I made multiple videos on the Kievan Rus if you're interested in its warfare, in the Scandinavian influences in the same. You have all prepared. Arriving in the first half of 1031, likely spending time in Staraya Ladoga, Aldeguborg in Norse Harald, and his men were warmly welcomed by Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, whose wife Ingegerd was a distant relative. Yaroslav, as many Germano-Slavic rulers, was in dire need of military leaders, of war bands, and recognizing Harald's potential, he was quite a sight to behold, and his connections were definitely well known, made him a captain of his own forces, partly because Harald was Olaf's brother, in fact, who had been exiled to Yaroslav's court in 1028, as we saw before. Ingegerd was a Swedish princess, proper, likely facilitated Harald's integration into the Ruthenian court, leveraging her familial ties to Scandinavian royalty to secure Harald's position. The broader environment would have been quite exciting for Harald. The Ruthenians, in their Vangian rule, had originated from different Scandinavian leaders, mostly these war bands of Swedish ancestry, from the late 8th century, and named by the Slavs as properly the Rus, with some debated etymology revolving around Slavic, Finnic descriptions. These men had navigated Eastern Europe's rivers and estuaries to forge trade routes with Constantinople, then Europe's most concentrated power, and in any case quite connected with these continental backwaters. I made a video about how the Byzantine evangelization and broader cultural connections weren't as successful as the Roman ones. As we've seen, Knut the Great went to Rome. Everything was already well set for the further evangelization of the Scandinavians. Constantinople basically stuck to the Balkans, Eastern Europe. The Khazars at this point actually had been knocked out by the same Kievan Rus that had emerged as a hell of a power in the region, and in fact was even not this overwhelmingly under Constantinople in a deeper cultural sense. For example, the Kievans had a lot of German weaponry imports, just like the Scandinavians. There was Turkic influence, and not this enormous Byzantine one in material culture. I mean, Ruthenian icons would show that for sake of broader political reason, and indeed connections with Constantinople, but especially before the Mongol conquest, Eastern Europe was much closer to Central Europe. It was actually almost indistinguishable from some, at least the ways it would more radically become in the later Middle Ages. And in this sense, it was actually a land in continuous expansion and leading, in fact, the way all along. The Varangians that also, as we'll see better now, also with the same Harald, notoriously had constituted, I made multiple videos about this, an important part of the Imperial Byzantine Guard in Constantinople. There is also an underappreciated, actually much larger amount of Scandinavians that had settled the Byzantine Empire as farmers, colonists, mostly involved in the military, but essentially merging with the local Romanian population. If anything, again, I discussed these topics at length. And Varangian leaders were at some point, again, some princes from the north that went over to Constantinople to be further sort of acculturated and civilized, making money through the loot, as we will see also with Harald. Basically, the Byzantines said to the Norse, okay, lay this place waste and take most of the loot for us, and then we will occupy it as Byzantines during the reconquests of lost Roman territory at Similia. By the mid here, the first half of the 11th century, this mechanism was well oiled, structured. That's also what will facilitate Harald to go there. Again, here we're talking about very high political figures that the Byzantines were very well glad to host. Right? Consider that also, like, the geographical proximity is not the whole story. It's mostly a cultural path. As we were saying before, the Anglo-Danes, for example, crushed at Hastings, were crushed by the Siculo-Normans at the Iraqian, as many refugees post-Hastings had fled Britain to Constantinople, essentially continuing on the same footsteps of this broader sort of Norse arc that, in theory, like the same Anglo-Saxons were part of historically, regardless of their greater civilization in a post-Roman world, with an older Christianization and more. Right? They were very similar in many ways to the Scandinavians, who were originally also Scandinavian in great part. This is relevant because it shows, as we were saying before, a bit also the fading of this world. In the young Harald's time, of course, instead, this was still a viable mechanism. There were probably some indicators that things were sort of turning the other way around. Very different from the times of Rurik that we mentioned before, 830 and 880 circa, managing to, if anything, install himself with his Norse as marrying to the local Slavic dynasties. There wasn't really a Scandinavian takeover. There are, at this point historiographically, a few doubts about the fact that the Kievan Rus remain a substantially Slavic land. But we should not underestimate either a Slavic-ruled land as well, but that the elite, the Slavic establishment, was in fact married into these war bands that had managed to settle down differently from other times in history, where sometimes you have lots of foreign mercenaries that actually don't settle down. Here it is the case because this greater Eastern European world was quite permeable. It offered many opportunities. It allowed to reach as far as the Middle East. Right. In fact, as we will see with Harald, he likely may have arrived in Byzantine service even in Mesopotamia, although it's not really confirmed. It's likely, though. The Norse arrived up to the Caspian Sea, beyond. Right. We don't know. It's like they normally didn't leave at least any specific attestation. But we can imagine them reaching also Far East Asia to some degree. Why not? Right? Not consistently, not routinely, but still, and obviously enough. I mean, there were Alans from the Caucasus still making up like part of the bodyguard of the Chinese Yuan Mongols in the 13th century. Why not the Norse later on? This is important because there is also overlap between the Vikings and the same Normans in this more Western, Frankish, civilized sense, used as mercenaries by the Byzantines way before Manzikert the Crusades. I mean, that's barely, after the same Harald's death. So where do Vikings and these guys appear? It was a part of a broader Western dimension at that point. Those were Latin mercenaries, lots of Franks, lots of Normans, but from places, again, like, in fact, Normandy, Sicily. And when we say Norman, actually, it's a synecdoche. Many of them were from other parts of France, Germany. Some would have still been Scandinavian, by the way. There were Lombards, Italians. So later on, down the line, this thing had already watered down, especially in Harald's time, especially if you took this broader Latin perspective. Because this is also what, as you know, Schwerpunkt points out, that this broader hype for the centrality of Constantinople, it's maybe something this more fringe peoples would have conceived. There is a massive hole in pop cultural representation in terms of the sheer magnitude of the Latin Germanic Franco-Roman civilization at this point. That was by far the biggest pivot and the greatest engine of this whole. Basically, the Viking era existed because that system allowed them to infiltrate, not because there was this propulsive force from the fringe of Europe. This is absolutely consolidated historiographically. And that's what makes also the history of Harald such a tragic drama in the full line with the heroic Norse heroic poetry and the Germanic ethos in general of the warrior that is so great and brave. But there is that pinch of sin, a bit like Achilles' heel, right? There's literally the same thing that eventually will have him done, right? Like Siegfried. And imagine these peoples, of course, sharing all that oral tradition, by the way, that especially a certain part of historiography overtly fixates with the unreachability of, because they simply don't study compared mythology in the European texts. They think, again, that like in post-traditional words, that these were just specific, like Norse paganism, as if this was a categorical set of belief. That it wasn't, right? It was just part of a broader Indo-European Geist that resonated even within the same Christendom at this point, all the way from Arjuna to the Templars, Bernard of Clairvaux, the entire Neapolitan. And again, this is not much of a mystery, as a matter of fact. But in this sense, the exclusivity of more like French era, like simply the Norse, the Byzantine, and basically no other understanding of Western history is heavily problematic and mostly the indicator of cultural educational inferiority in today's world, but his point in historiographical development, but just sort of basic education. I mean, this is not something that, first was written like that. No. First, it was written like, of course, the West was overwhelmingly recognized without any doubt, the central engine here. Just somebody in the last decades wanted to deflect from that, and internet culture doubling on that without any actual historical relevance, as a matter of fact. And this, again, does not mean, especially the Kievan Rus was not an enormous enterprise. The Varangians had helped reinforcing key trading hubs, notably Novgorod, Kiev. These were the most important centers, the latter especially rising to hegemony. Right, the Kievan Rus was never fully united in a political sense, but the Rirke dynasty was at least the pretended measure of legitimization of the Kievan rulers by a concept of seniorate, where Kiev stood out as by far the most advanced and powerful part of the Rus, that had also pretty blurred boundaries. I mean, where did the Slavs arrive? In the northeast. When, right? We'll never fully know, but we can also realize that, of course, the greatest pivot of great part of Eastern European civilization was Kiev. By the 10th century, the Varangians, Varengiar in Old Norse, Varichadze in Slavonic, Varangoi in Greek, expanded Kiev's territory to span the Danube to Volga rivers and the Baltic to Black Seas. Right, they were the mercenaries, the paid war bands of the great princes of the citadels, the Kremlins, staying over these fortified hilltops, essentially, and suburbs of along the great Ruthenian rivers. The hinterland was not very glued together. Even there was probably a difference between these centers and their respective countrysides. If anything, however, the great Ruthenian riverways allowed for pretty far and wide strategic projection that could, simply by controlling these river ports and the mouths of the great Ruthenian rivers, simply make a lot of money, accumulating a lot of wealth, without, in fact, even bothering controlling, for example, the southernmost part of the steppes populated by the Turks, who were mostly subjects. As we've seen, the Khazars had been disintegrated by the Kievan Rus in this momentous expansion. And that was basically it, right? That's why the thing also passed through the same trade routes initially dominated by the Vikings, and or at least by these Slavic powers that facilitated the Varangian passage for their own benefit. Though the Varangians gradually assimilated, 10th, 11th century Rus rulers kept welcoming new Scandinavian warriors. They were, during the Viking era, sort of more specialized, more cohesive. Again, the Norse had quite well exploited the post-Carolingian crisis to start sacking and pillaging different parts of Europe, all across Europe, in some of the richest places of the same. They had never fully, been the masters around. Only a few peoples, and mostly towards Northern Europe, will soundly be conquered by the Norse. That remained, however, some sort of still backwater outside of Scandinavia. However, they had specialized in the process of looting, of pillaging, organizing naval expeditions. This sense reinvesting their wealth home to, as we've seen, strengthen their polities and gradually emerging as feudal Christian monarchies. A prominent Rus leader, Volodymyr I, reigning between 970 and 1015, even visited Norway in 977 to recruit a Viking arm from Hakon II Sigurdsson's court to secure his throne in Kiev. So the connections between Kiev and Norway were quite strong. In 987, Volodymyr's conversion to Greek Orthodox Christianity, it was a largely political but nevertheless consistent move, set a religious precedent for Eastern Europe and the Rus that in fact started at this point building up a hell of a power on a more proper statal basis with an ecclesiastical administration with ever larger armies, also again fueled by Norse manpower. It was, after all, their interest, to keep a bit like the Slavic population more subservient, mostly making the local merchant estates of these great centers on the riverways happy. But they needed, in this sense, some foreign force that would not be treacherous like the local Slavic policy that would end up, in fact, eroding part the same Kievan Rus over the centuries. And therefore counting also pretty tough, professional military forces as the ones that Scandinavia could produce, especially in increasingly as long as the Viking era went. Of course, the early days were a bit more primitive, a bit more sort of war-banding, migration era style, but at this point things had gotten really sort of more official. There was a role, of course, of general backwardness. We're talking the 10th, 11th century in Eastern Europe. You can imagine what it really was. But at these spheres, the ones of Harald, things were very advanced, very rich, very classy, so to say, and very rewarding. Byzantine Emperor Basil II, made lots of videos about him ruling between 976 and 1025, offered his sister's hand in exchange for 6,000 Varangian soldiers to quell a rebellion in the Byzantine Empire, forming the Varangian Guard. Officially, there had already been Norsemen in the Byzantine Guard, but at this point they are properly enucleated as a historically recognizable unit on its own in 988. Remember that the Ruthenians had aggressed the Byzantines, had plundered the suburbs of Constantinople. They had, again, not posed a major territorial threat, but they had infested the Danubian estuary. They had essentially, threatened also the Byzantine coastline possessions in Crimea and in the northern Black Sea in general. So this unit of Norsemen would maintain a Slavo-Norse character that would also include a more international membership than commonly acknowledged. I still have to make videos about the later Varangian Guard that was there still by the later Middle Ages, but there were different members and, if anything, different political affiliations compared to the Viking era. This is the importance that the Varangians already had when Harald entered Yaroslav's service, that, by the way, had connections also with the West. My name actually has historically a Ruthenian connection, even though it originated elsewhere, and that's a very interesting story. But just for saying that this was not just about, again, this the Rus isolated, mostly just interacting just with Constantinople and Scandinavia. No, right? It was, as we explained before, a great connection with Central and even Western Europe that could be quite, again, tactical, in many ways from a diplomatic and political standpoint, but still present and definitely relevant and influential. This is important also as far as Harald is concerned, because, Harald Godwinson, who defeated and killed him, is also a bit the example of that, Anglo-Danish awareness of the Western world. Harald went over to Normandy, where he fought as a Norman knight, all right? And he could fight in the typical sort of Anglo-Danish phalanx fashion. He could even have his horsemen fighting in the light hit-and-run tactics of the Celts of the Welsh fringe. So when you imagine Harald arriving in the East, as we will see now, he will have an incredible career, both in the Rus and especially in Constantinople. He would have actually been exposed, and this is an underestimated aspect, a lot of Western influence as well. Everybody, picks normally a topic like Harald Hardrada as saying, oh wow, this is so cool. Imagine how East he arrived, because, this connection between there are, especially in today's ideological backgrounds, lots of reason why this is done. It has eminently contemporary political reasons for that. I'm not saying what, because we're not interested, but the Leviathan in the room is the fact that if you fight in the Mediterranean, even if you stay in places like Kiev or Scandinavia, you will have an enormous Franco-Roman influence, Latin Christian influence, right? And even though, for example, Harald will not live to see the so-called Great Schism that was not even meant to be in the moment, what would turn out to be. And there were differences, in fact, already in the Eastern and Western churches. Still, there was also a sense that, for example, the Roman papacy was more or less aligned with everyone involved, like both with the East and the West. And this is also a moment in which, for example, the Italian navies are starting to sweep the Western Mediterranean from the Saracens, not differently from how the Varangians behaved. Besides, we've seen how, there was some kind of rivalry in that term. The Venetians were already strong. We've seen it in the video about the Battle of the Iraqian, even mocking the Normans at sea. At that point, there were secular Normans rather than others. So there are in the West. The Venetians are Westerners, but they have just tactical interest, let's say, in what the Byzantines can't really subcontract them with. So we made lots of videos about the stuff. We talked about the Slavs on the Adriatic. So all places and peoples that you have to imagine Harald being aware of. And I've never heard listened to a documentary or read or heard any other sort of interest in the connection with these other peoples. Because in part, this does not emerge. It would have been a secondary aspect. But he wasn't living in a simply isolated world when he was just, the rough and tough Viking guy from sort of the... just that sort of isolationistic meme of what the Vikings were supposed to be. And this is actually a compliment to Harald, because he definitely was a man of his time, but also in an exceptional degree of knowledge, which was required also of such an illustrious leader. Remember also Saint Olaf, right? And the Roman connection there, which is critical. The Varangian Guard's formation was formalized historically by probably a treaty between Kiev and Constantinople, facilitating and ensuring a steady supply of Scandinavian warriors to Constantinople. And in fact, this is the main point. Initially, the Varangians are a bit more Slavic, then they tend to become a bit more northern when we look at the Varangian Guard of Constantinople. As we've seen later, even the English would arrive. There would have already been at this point some Anglo-Danish rule. Knut the Great was, as we've seen in England, in Rome. It's pretty obvious that some of his men would have served also in Constantinople's Varangian Guard. And God knows, just imagine all the faces, all the names that Harald would have known in all these tales and sagas of heroes, really permeating this world as a incredibly fluid tapestry of cosmic firmament evaluation of these soldiers' accomplishment. In my video about the Varangian Guard, I illustrated, for example, through some also sagas, that were evidently also, as Norse sources, quite interested in Constantinople, the enormous treasures in terms of, for example, just prize panoplies that the Byzantines would confer to specific Norse leaders that were magnificent, exquisite. The Byzantines were at this point mastering arms and armor technology, right? The West did as well, but we're at the same level. Scandinavia was a bit more, to arrive, to get there, and in fact they imported a lot of weapons from themselves from the Rhineland, as you know. By the early 11th century, so when Harald arrived in Ruthenia, Byzantine emperors employed Normans, Germans, and Turks in traditionally structured units led by their own officers. This was really typical of the Byzantine army from a long time, for similar reasons to the ones we've seen also in other peoples, including the Ruthenians. And in particular, towards this part of history, they would increasingly replace the regular Byzantine army. Right? There had historically been properly a bulky Byzantine sort of national force that had gradually become either militia and or more professional. And thanks to the sort of general exoneration, confiscation, etc., that was going on within the Byzantine society that we discussed also as far as its tax system, as it, say, increasingly oligarchic profile was concerned. So it meant that Constantinople had an enormous amount of wealth with which it could buy the same troops that would defend the capital, together, of course, with some Byzantine regulars, to say the least. The empire had an enormous force, but these foreigners would be quite connected properly with the imperial palace, in virtue of the fact they were foreigners in a strange land that would have not simply supported them otherwise hadn't the emperor sheltered them, which made them very loyal to leadership. Byzantine generals retain overall command, so it's not like you find, aside from, usually the guard served with the emperor, so the emperor would be the commander there. But there were also other instances in which the Varangians served under Byzantine generals, as we will see now also with Harald, in different theaters, with an important degree of autonomy sometimes. In 1031, Harald joined Yaroslav's campaign against the Polish duke, later King Boleslav I, nicknamed the Brave, to reclaim lost territory in 1018, a successful effort. Poland and Ruthenia were very close at the time. They shared a seigniorate system that allowed, in fact, different rulers from both sides to float across each other's land. And there's a very intense and interesting Polish-Ruthenian warfare at some point we'll make a better video on. I've already done it for both regions, but if anything, not too much exclusively about their sort of clash. Also mutual support at a point. So imagine also Harald having this Polish experience. Until 1034, Harald, however, fought mostly along Kiev's southern frontier against the Turkic Pechenegs, fierce steppe warriors skilled in mounted archery, people who owled to the moon in their shamanic rites before the days of battle, and that were to be found around for quite a while, also in the Byzantine army from a long time, and really very similar to a plethora of Turkic tribes that, coming in different ways after one another, regardless of their ethnonyms, were basically the same thing, also in style of warfare. Talking about the Kumans later on, you will find them for a long time in Germany in the 13th and 14th century as mercenaries, etc. There had historically been also a Viking penetration in Central Europe to other paths like Hungary. Apparently the Magyars themselves had some Vikings when coming to loot as far as, southern Italy, northern Spain, northeastern France, but through Hungary, not from northern Europe. And so the same Balkans actually betray some interesting descent of these peoples. That's also the big picture we have, not the bigger picture we haven't dealt with, that I find it extremely interesting because the more I study medieval history, the more I see it repeated. The fact that wasn't the migration in Europe similar to this mechanism? It was different, right? But even, the 14th century German mercenaries spread across Europe to the Free Company's times. The Indo-European conquests, since before these, there were channels in Europe that brought to the sort of different waves of peoples. Very often were illiterate. They didn't properly leave a trace back in the day, including the Vikings most of the times. If not from a genetic point of view, we know that, I mean, it's very difficult to tell whether, I don't know, accorded where genetic background is something from, I mean, there are ways to tell whether they're probably from the Bronze Age or just maybe from the Middle Ages. But surely they are stratified in that fashion as well in many areas of Europe. Imagine, again, as a Kievan soldier fighting against the Pecheneг Turkic horse archers, and also they had an armored elite, as a matter of fact. Harald found himself in this situation, and really had, in this sense, a hell of a military experience, because he fought against so many different types of enemies. Possibly, for example, in the 30s, other Kievan enemies like the Chudes in Estonia. I made a video about medieval Estonia. The Baltics are a bit, underrated during the Viking era, or at least sort of unconsidered. Without mentioning that Harald at some point fought against the Byzantines himself, right? Harald did spill imperial blood at some time before joining the Varangian Guard. And this was, again, completely normal. It could happen for different reasons. There were a lot of rebels in the Byzantine Empire. Maybe they were just making Constantinople a favor. But there were proper raids, piracy, violence of different kind. It's incredibly difficult to sort of recompose in a single thread web like the political affiliations of Eastern Europe, the Black Sea, etc. But there were a lot, and the Kievan Rus at this point was a hell of a regional power that could afford also some very high military standards. This is also relatively underrated. I mean, it's not like the Vikings. I mean, the Norse could provide these, again, shards of, pretty darn tough mother blippers, right? Mostly on foot at this point, were, however, horsemen as well. We will come back on the important development of, especially later Viking warfare in general, tactical practice, because there's always a meme, a stereotype of how they would have fought, and which would have been preferentially also accurate for the time. But they weren't just that, all right? And the Kievan military was incredibly advanced for the era. They had they had a bit of still individualistic warriorism baked into them, because, again, yes, they were powerful, etc., but still relatively primitive. The Kievans, for example, would maintain, differently from the Westerners for a while, something really Asian flavored, let's say, in the steppe tradition, as far as an increased combination of, let's say, shock, but also missile effect in the same warrior, right? But it also had, in terms of collective training, pretty darn good cavalries in general. They imported the finest Western weapons with this Byzantine and Turkic influences as well, into a pretty original military synthesis that characterizes them. Again, I made lots of videos about the Kievans, the Varangians. You can find all there, including overlapping Viking history. So imagine at this point, even though man matured earlier at the time, Harald was not yet 20 years old, right? But he fought like crazy, because those are the years in immense growth where you're really crazy, right? Your prefrontal cortex is not solidified yet. You're hyped as hell. You're hyperloaded in testosterone. You're basically crazy, violent, reckless, daring, because you're not even thinking about that. That's the most brutal, at point also deadly school. Harald would have been beaten pretty early by the bitter realization, not just that, wounds hurt, that broken bones are pretty nasty, but also to see, his brothers dead, right? These war bands were sworn brotherhoods right in front of God, as if they were a soul body. So seeing a part of that dying, feeling the stench, the rotting, the misery of this war, like, it is really tough, right? But hell, the way this was vented against the enemy, right? You don't want to know what these young men did when they put their hands over their men, their women, by the way, the various various subject populations. There was a sort of cleaner, a courtly dimension where properly the status of the members required a particular code, etiquette even. But when there was an outer world representing the darkness, the abyss, the untamed chaos, where you could let loose hell. For real. If you're interested in this, I made a video about the Germanic Gefolgschaft Comitatus that partly embraces the Viking era as well, but in that video. But even if it is about migration here, it's basically adequate to describe also what was happening later. At this point, by the way, Harald had been successfully tested because he was well compensated, with evidence suggesting Kievan Varangians at this point also receiving 12-month contracts paid in coin or goods like furs. There was a florid fur, slave, and timber aside from probably the Amber Road that passed through, also through the east, but mostly through the west, Central Europe to northern Italy. Like this great exchange and flow that partly derived exactly from the raids on different villages. You could, that had their own storages of this kind of goods for building, for covering themselves. And he would arrive, storming these places, massacre the people, and or at least getting the slaves, depending on what you wanted to do, and bringing them to leaders that stabilized their frontiers in this way, crushed their enemies. And again, the practices were really horrifying at some point. Harald's campaigns, including defending the Rus stronghold of Chersonesus in 1032, were in the Black Sea, where he led a contingent against Pecheneck raiders, showcasing his growing reputation as a commander, right? Imagine in this sort of sunny, coastal, and fairly, there would have been Greek, Roman ruins, especially imagine 1,000 years ago, how much there was of that there, of this howling Turkic horsemen coming to swarm around your fortified rings that were set on fire, looking a bit like Vienna's court hall in the Nibelungenlied, with the brothers being surrounded and drinking each other's blood to survive under the heat. These are the visions and tales that inflamed these guys' minds, right? And there wasn't just, again, an emotional unhingement, because the entire point here is that it's not like, today's people think that warfare is to say, taking guts to simply go against the enemy and getting himself killed. Every idiot can do that. You can train very easily and very quickly a human to get himself killed. The problem is to go attack the enemy in the exact moment you must do that, right? And that is very strategical, requires what people lack today, that is to say, a massive backbone in psychophysical capacity, relentlessly trained, but these extenuating experiences. Just think about the stamina of these people. Today's people, I presume also by some genetic standard, have been sensibly weakened across the generations, probably not to be able to activate a level of preservation during these stress times. This experience would destroy us. Instead, this guy, by 20 years old, had already lived through that before. Like a 20-year-old at the time, this was like a 30-year-old today, right? Or even more in different ways. But this is the beauty of it all. Drawn by tales of grand adventures and treasures from returning Varangians, Harald traveled in June 1034 down the Dnieper River to the Black Sea and then to Constantinople. This is where we end today's chapter. Constantinople, the 11th century greatest medieval European city. Snorri's Harald Saga describes his arrival, quote, with a large following, suggesting he led a group of Varangian troops, of course, some possibly from his post-Stiklestad exile as well. Those men had stuck with him in spite of all peril and emargination, discrimination, exile, and so on. These people were, we should also actually explain this, that, as I said it all before, that this was the lowest moment, at least after the exile. Here things were sort of improving, eminently enough. Also because you could not present yourself in Constantinople at the head of this man if you weren't already a big shot. And as we've seen, the Ruthenians already backed Olaf's faction, so Harald was welcome. But the broader thing for them was revenge in Scandinavia, right? That's what exactly the whole thing is basically paying. This whole military experience here we just described was paying for your sins, was intended as a spiritual journey, as a form of expiations for the defeat that had led, for example, these men alive instead of fighting to the death together with their leader, right? That was the greatest ambition of all heroes in all time, to gain properly their place in the Valhalla, in the firmament, to participate to the end-time battle that the entire Catholic tradition fully embraces. So here it was all designed, as also many sagas that we have encountered in other videos, to properly come back and get what was your own. It's a beautiful sort of trope, beautiful archetypal meaning that obviously enters this saga par excellence, like Harald Hardrada's. In 1034, Harald and his Varangians thus joined the Byzantine navy, right? This is also very important because North Sea, Baltic warfare, Atlantic warfare were different from the Mediterranean one. That was, however, more advanced, right? Again, when you think about the Vikings, be aware of the fact that they weren't the most advanced naval military out there, right? The Mediterranean was way more advanced. And in this sense, gaining an experience there was even more rewarding than any northern experience in this kind. However, the Varangians would be enlisted, so to say, in the navy, exactly also because they had a lot of maritime experience. And so it's, regardless of the difference, was mostly in the scale of command, right? But technically and by approximation, we're talking the same kind of experience. Really a fitting role for northern mercenaries renowned for their seafaring skills. So his entry into Byzantine service was marked by his appointment to a naval command under Admiral George Maniakes, who had also a quite important role in the first half of 11th century Byzantine politics, as we have seen in other videos, and who valued Harald's, as well as this other Norwegian and other Scandinavian Vikings, in naval tactics that will turn out to be, in fact, quite beneficial to the empire as well. But that's for another episode. Again, I'm really glad we have covered this topic. We have initiated this saga. This is just, as you understand, like the entry, and not even like now the more exciting things are going to start. But I'm glad because we haven't made so many videos about Viking warfare, and there are different reasons. As you have explained here, the leitmotif is that sometimes we have overly sort of popularized the Vikings at the expense of other peoples, and we have lost the plot of comparative capacity whenever we look at who was who actually in, and by which degree around the year 1000, like at this point. But at the same time, the best way to discuss these peoples that had their importance in the world, to say the least, is to actually describe them for whom they were, right? Because if you don't get that, you also don't get how and why they were that relevant, even though they, again, belong to a sort of fringe of the world, especially as the Viking era, let's say the Viking invasions were gradually winding down. I mean, it's not like, I don't know, the later medieval Scandinavians themselves engage into this stuff. Why? Right? Simply because there were other powers around, not because having a more civilized way of life isn't the indicator of actual advancement. In actual power, it was much greater and consolidated than in Viking era. It was more like a predatory, almost a parasitary form of exploitation of the political crisis of other peoples that also basically didn't back down and simply also obliged the Norse to leave, because there wasn't much that they could objectively do from their background about it. As you know, I also have lots of playlists covering every single century by order. So just for the record, if you like the 11th that Harald's lifespan completely covered, just look at what we're covering here. Medieval Serbia, the Western cloisters, massacred, and the Battle of Antioch, 1098. I mean, here we're talking about even after his life, within the 11th century. Medieval Roman warlords, for example. How many people have even heard of this? It's a very important sort of primary Roman history, engulfing the whole Italy, the whole sort of imperial dynamics, right? And you don't kid with that, but does anybody know this? Or medieval knightly combat psychology. What about the more mounted chivalric feudal system? The Milites Strenuissimi of Milan. How many know these people, as opposed to the Vikings of the same era? From Constantine the IX to Alexius I, here we are more or less the same time. Hastings, medieval Polish heavy infantrymen who would have faced Harold, hopefully, although not likely coming out of there alive. Henry I of England. Yeah, Henry I of England is just the same century of Harald. The Gregorian Apostolic Legation, the Komnenian era, okay, the Battle of the Iraqian, we said, the Ottonian army organization, the Gregorian reforms, much of that, the same Alexius I Komnenos, the Varangian guardsmen, here we are, Robert II, the Capetians, the Kingdom of Croatia, Zoe, Constantine IX Monomachus, Michael Cellus, urban power before the Italian communes, the Fatimid army, the Italian maritime domination of the Mediterranean, etc., etc. So, there isn't just, that, right? Single moment. Imagine, again, I know that school systems around different countries in the world still talk mostly about the Viking era. Maybe they don't actually split the Middle Ages into that, but to most of Europe, the Vikings were secondary, right? It's painful maybe to hear, to stress, but if we really are interested in European history by objective accuracy, we have also to explain better how and why what we're describing was what it is, and we can't deny the whole picture. Very well. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.